Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! The voices of immigrant children crying for their parents inside a U.S. Customs and Border Protection facility. This comes as President Trump is continuing to defend his administration's policy of forcibly separating the children from their parents at the border in violation of international human rights law.
The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. It won't be.
We'll speak to Congressmember Pramila Jayapal of Washington State and Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas, then to Nicaragua.
In Nicaragua, anti-government protests over the past 2 months have led to the killing of at least 178 people, almost entirely at the hand of the police forces and by armed pro-government groups.
As a major city in Nicaragua declares independence from Daniel Ortega's government, we'll speak to a top Nicaraguan diplomat about the escalating crisis. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump is continuing to defend his administration's practice of forcibly separating immigrant children from their parents at the border in violation of international human rights law.
The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. It won't be. You look at what's happening in Europe, you look at what's happening in other places. We can't allow that to happen to the United States, not on my watch.
But we need her seated. During his speech on Monday, Trump also falsely claimed Democrats were to blame for the practice. More than 2,000 children have been forcibly separated from their parents since mid-April alone. Trump also went on a xenophobic Twitter rant Monday about migration into Europe, tweeting, "Crime in Germany is way up. Big mistake made all over Europe in allowing millions of people in who we have so strongly and violently changed their culture," unquote. In fact, Germany recently recorded its lowest crime rate since 1992. Trump also tweeted, "We don't want what is happening with immigration in Europe to happen with us." Trump is meeting with Republicans today as the House is slated to hold votes on 2 separate immigration bills later this week. Outrage is continuing to mount over the Trump administration's practice of forcibly taking children away from their parents, which the American Association of Pediatrics calls government-sanctioned child abuse. The Pulitzer Prize-winning news outlet ProPublica released audio from inside a U.S. Customs and Border Protection facility in which children, estimated to be between the ages of 4 and 10 years old, are heard crying "Mama" and "Papi" after being separated from their parents. A warning: the video and audio is disturbing.
Well, we have an orchestra here, right? What we're missing is a conductor.
Of the audio, a Border Patrol agent is heard joking in Spanish, "Well, we have an orchestra here. What's missing is a conductor." Only minutes after the audio was released, Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen began a White House press briefing during which she repeatedly lied by claiming only congressional action could stop the practice of separating children and parents. During the briefing, a reporter from New York Magazine played the audio of the children weeping out loud, leading one reporter to ask Kirstjen Nielsen, "How is this not child abuse?" Meanwhile, the technology company Microsoft is facing threats of a boycott over its collaboration with ICE, that's the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. Over the weekend, a blog post from January resurfaced in which Microsoft said it's proud to support ICE and that Microsoft's technology can help the agency quote, accelerate facial recognition and identification, unquote. In response to the online outrage and boycott threats, the company said, quote, Microsoft is dismayed by the forcible separation of children from their families at the border, unquote. We'll have more on the mounting outrage over the practice of forcibly separating thousands of immigrant children from their parents at the border after headlines. We'll be speaking with Pramila Jayapal, the Congress member from Washington State, as well as Sheila Jackson Lee. Both have visited detention centers in their states. The U.S. and South Korea have canceled joint military exercises on the Korean peninsula scheduled for August, a week after President Trump vowed to end the United States' provocative war games during his historic summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un has traveled to China to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping in his third trip to China so far this year. Meanwhile, President Trump has threatened to impose tariffs on an additional $200 billion worth of Chinese goods, escalating the threat of trade war between the U.S. and China. In more news on the Pentagon, President Trump announced Monday he'll direct the military to create a sixth branch of the armed forces aimed at dominating outer space.
When it comes to defending America, it is not enough to merely have an American presence in space. We must have American dominance in space. So important. Very importantly, I'm hereby directing the Department of Defense and Pentagon to immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the sixth branch of the armed forces. That's a big statement. We are going to have the Air Force and we are going to have the Space Force, separate but equal.
That was President Trump speaking at a meeting of the National Space Council Monday. The Air Force currently oversees all outer space-related military activity. In his announcement, Trump said the Air Force and the Space Force would be separate but equal, parroting a phrase used to describe unconstitutional racial segregation. Defense Secretary James Mattis says he's opposed to creating a new Space Force. In Afghanistan, dozens of activists have arrived in the capital, Kabul, after a 435-mile march to demand peace. The march began with a dozen youth activists May 12th and swelled to over 70 men by the end of the 38-day journey, during which they crisscrossed government and Taliban-controlled territory. Their arrival in Kabul comes after the end of a historic three-day ceasefire between the Afghan military and the Taliban. This is Zamarai Zaland, one of the peace marchers.
We're calling on both the government and the Taliban to find a way for peace and to extend the ceasefire. We're feeling a pain in our hearts, and that's the pain of our people who are suffering from the conflicts. We want a ceasefire, and we want both sides to reach lasting peace in the country.
Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach needs more legal education. That's according to a federal judge who struck down Kansas's discriminatory voter ID laws and ordered their architect, Secretary of State Chris Kobach, to take 6 hours of legal classes. U.S. District Judge Julie Robinson ruled Kansas's law requiring voters show proof of citizenship prevented tens of thousands of eligible citizens from registering to vote. Kobach led the Trump administration's so-called Voter Fraud Commission and is a key architect of the GOP's voter suppression efforts nationwide. Former CIA software engineer Joshua Adam Schulte has been indicted on charges of violating the Espionage Act for allegedly leaking thousands of documents last year, revealing CIA programs and tools that are capable of hacking into both Apple and Android cell phones. WikiLeaks published the documents last March under the name Vault 7, calling it the largest leak of secret CIA documents in history. Schulte is already in federal custody on child pornography charges. And MoveOn, the United States' largest online progressive organization, has broken with House Democratic leadership and endorsed Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's challenging New York Congressmember Joe Crowley. Crowley regularly floated as a potential Speaker of the House, but he's facing his first primary challenge in 14 years. Ocasio-Cortez is a 28-year-old community organizer. In a debate with Crowley on New York One, moderated by Errol Lewis, she called for the abolition of ICE. That's the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. This clip begins with Crowley.
Where this government is separating children from their mothers. It is antithetical to everything that I believe in, and that's what I fight for every day.
And you know what? If this organization is as fascist as you have called it,
I've said it's fascist.
And you have said it's fascist, then why don't you adopt the stance to eliminate it? This is a moral problem, and your response has been to apply more paperwork to this situation, to have ICE collect more information on immigrants, and that puts our communities in danger, and it also conveys a profound misunderstanding of how we should be approaching this problem.
That's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's challenging New York Congressmember Joe Crowley in next Tuesday's primary. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Outrage continues to grow over the Trump administration's separation of children from their parents along the U.S.-Mexico border. On Monday, the news outlet ProPublica released audio from inside a U.S. Customs and Border Protection facility in which children estimated to be between the ages of 4 and 10 years old are heard crying mama and papa after being separated from their parents. A warning, the audio is disturbing.
In part of the audio, a Border Patrol agent is heard joking in Spanish, "Well, we have an orchestra here. What's missing is a conductor." Video footage released by the U.S. Border Patrol Monday shows migrant children in concrete-floored chain-link cages in an old warehouse in McAllen, Texas.
A new Quinnipiac poll shows roughly two-thirds of U.S. voters oppose separating children from their parents at the border. About 7% of Democratic voters support the Trump policy, while 55% of Republicans support it. Ahead of today's meeting with Republicans to discuss compromise legislation on hardline immigration bill, President Trump continued to blame Democrats for his policy that has led to the separation of at least 2,000 children in recent weeks.
The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. It won't be. You look at what's happening in Europe, you look at what's happening in other places. We can't allow that to happen to the United States, not on my watch. If the Democrats would sit down instead of obstructing, we could have something done very quickly. Good for the children, good for the country, good for the world. It could take place quickly. We could have an immigration bill.
Meanwhile, during a White House press briefing, Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen said the administration was only strictly enforcing immigration law.
DHS is not separating families legitimately seeking asylum at ports of entry. If an adult enters at a port of entry and claims asylum, they will not face prosecution for illegal entry. They have not committed a crime by coming to the port of entry. As I mentioned, DHS does have a responsibility to protect minors, and in that case as well, we will only separate the family if we cannot determine there is a familiar relationship, if the child may be at risk with the parent or legal guardian, or if the parent or legal guardian is referred for prosecution. We have a duty to protect the American people, and it's one that I take very seriously.
For more on the response to the Trump administration's new policy of separating children from their parents at the border, we're joined here in New York by Congressmember Pramila Jayapal, Democratic Congressmember from Washington State. She's just helped to announce a march on Washington and cities nationwide on June 30th against family separation. She's the vice-ranking member of the House Budget Committee and vice chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. On June 9th, she visited a detention center in Washington State and spoke with some of the 200 asylum seekers held at the SeaTac Bureau of Prisons facility. Congressmember Pramila Jayapal, it's great to have you back.
It's great to be with you.
Talk about the latest explanation. Some thought yesterday, possibly because of the just national, international outcry, that the President Trump would walk this back, but he hasn't. He has dug down.
He has dug down, doubled down, and I'll tell you, I think he's making a bad miscalculation. Americans across the country, Republicans, Democrats, independents, are outraged because there's so many parents amongst us. And you have to, as a parent, think about, and as a mother, I can tell you this, think about what it means to take a child who is breastfeeding and tear her off the breast of a mother, to take a 1-year-old child. And I heard from the 174 women that I met with at the federal prison, they're being held at a prison because all the detention centers are filled. These are 206 individuals who were transferred from Texas, from the border, to a federal prison. Some of them, about 40% of them, had been in detention for over a month. Not a single one of the mothers had seen their children. Not a single one of them had been able to say goodbye to their children. And only 2 out of all of the mothers that were there even knew where their children were. So Trump is making a bad miscalculation. He has said over and over again that he is using this as leverage to get his border wall, to get, very bad immigration policies that would cut legal migration to this country over the next many decades, policies that really very few people support. He continues to use immigration as a, piece of red meat that he throws to an increasingly shrinking, in my opinion, base. And you can see that by the fact that Franklin Graham, son of Billy Graham, Laura Bush, former First Lady, have all weighed in to say this is cruel, it's immoral, and by the way, it also doesn't work. It is not an effective deterrent because the women that I met with, you've covered so many of these countries over the years, over the decades, they are escaping terrible conditions. One of the women told me that she had 3 children. Her oldest child was shot and killed by gangs. I think she was from El Salvador. Her second child shot and paralyzed by gangs. She took her 3rd child, left her 2nd child, and took her 3rd child to try to bring that child to safety. These are the kinds of stories that people are fleeing, so they're making impossible choices. And separating children from their families at the border is illegal. The UN Human Rights Commissioner has weighed in and said it violates the rights of the child. They are asylum seekers. They should be getting what is called a credible fear hearing. And instead, the Trump administration just continues to, double down and think that he's going to somehow be solving a problem here.
What's your response to the claims of President Trump and his aides that they are only following the law, that the law had been in place beforehand but was not being followed by prior administrations, and they feel they now must follow the law?
It is just hogwash. I could use a lot of words for it, but I'm going to say hogwash here. This is a result of the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy. What they did when they put that into place, and you hear Jeff Sessions talk about it back in February, various people have talked about this was actually done to deter people from coming, which, by the way, is illegal. Our courts have ruled that you cannot use detention as deterrence. But what they have done now is said we're going to criminally prosecute everyone who comes across the border, including these asylum seekers. Now, the majority of the 174 women that I spoke with were asylum seekers. Not a single one had received a credible fear hearing, and they had been taken into courts en masse, 75, 100 people at a time, mass prosecutions, really no due process, criminally prosecuted when really what they should have gotten is a credible
And clearly
hearing.
there's no way to adjudicate an individual's credible fear of persecution if they are in a group trial.
That's right. And it was a criminal prosecution. It was not an asylum hearing. And they weren't evaluated at all. There is a question, too, by the way. Some of these folks have been pleading guilty because, in fact, all of them have, because they hope that they're going to be reunited with their children if they do that. And instead, what might happen is when you apply for asylum, you're asked, have you been charged of a crime? This is technically a crime, so we don't know yet how this will affect their asylum hearings. But the stories I heard were just heartbreaking. Women who talked about being deceived. They were with their children. They turned themselves in. They were then, excuses made like you're going to go get a photograph taken or you're going to go to court and see a judge. And they came back and their children were gone. No chance to say goodbye. Some of them talked about being in the room right next door to their children so they could hear them screaming for them, crying for them. You showed pictures of the cages that the children were held in. The women described the same things. They talked about the facilities by nicknames like the Icebox and the Dog Pound. Icebox because the temperatures were so frigidly cold. And they crossed the Rio Grande. They're wet. They're put into these frigidly cold facilities. No mats, no blankets, no clean drinking water in some cases for up to 5 days. So the administration would love to take the focus off of the fact that they put this policy in place. They can reverse it today. They would love to have the focus turned to legislation that both sides need to pass, but that is just not true.
And I just want to be very clear here. You visited a prison?
I visited a prison.
And you visited prison. We've seen the Congress members who went en masse to Texas. They were in McAllen. They were in all different places. You're a Congress member from Washington State, and you were in Washington State. These women were flown up from the border.
Correct.
Their children still presumably in Texas?
All over the place. So some of the women were given slips of paper that had their name, their A number, which is their immigration number, and then the names of the children, their children, supposedly. But one woman pointed to the slip of paper and said to me, these are not my children. So there is a real question also about whether these agencies, because there's the U.S. Marshals, there's Customs and Border Protection, there's Immigration Customs Enforcement, there's DHS, there's the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Nobody knows, and we have not been able to get the answers to whether or not these agencies are coordinated and whether or not they actually know where these children are. Not a single one of these women, actually I take that back, 2 women had known where their children were, but had not spoken to them. But the rest of them had no idea where they were.
And yet Kirstjen Nielsen insisted, parents and children, the kids are Skyping their parents, they're talking to them on the phone. They can do that regularly. She boasted about how the migrant children in custody were being dealt with.
It is important to note that these minors are very well taken care of. Don't believe the press. They are very well taken care of. We operate according to some of the highest standards in the country. We provide food, medical, education, and all needs that the child requests.
This was in the same, at the same time, yesterday and a few days ago when she spoke, that she said the separations aren't happening.
Right. She has gone back and forth, as has Trump. But we have it on record that this is a policy that has been carefully crafted by Stephen Miller, put into place by the Trump administration. They are now, and Trump himself has said that he wants to use the children as leverage to get his border wall and to get his regressive immigration policies. We have been saying over and over again that what they are doing can be undone today by the president, does not require congressional action. This does not need to be about legislation. And I would just say that the Ryan bill that is going to come to the floor of the House this week, that they say offers a fix to this, actually makes things much worse. It allows for family detention indefinitely. It takes away the due process rights that unaccompanied children would get. It is a terrible bill. So anyone who says it's a moderate compromise is really missing the boat. And we should vote those bills down. Hopefully they will both fail. But then the Trump administration must implement a reversal of this policy. And we'll have a mass demonstration anchored by Move On and also by the National Domestic Workers Alliance, June 30th, Lafayette Park, 11 o'clock, hundreds of organizations, unions, faith leaders, all kinds of organizations that are participating, because I think people really are outraged, and we should be outraged. These conditions are cruel.
And you talk about the demonstration, but is it your hope to basically get a reversal of the Trump administration policy, or do you feel that, given the fact that he's doubled down, that there has to be some kind of congressional action to supersede the president in this case?
I mean, I would love to see congressional action, but I don't think that they should be able to try to say that if this policy continues, that it's the failure of Congress, because he put this into place, and he has a habit of doing this, Juan, as you know. He did this with the Dreamers. He said, I'm reversing DACA. Now it's Congress's fault that they haven't passed a permanent solution for the Dreamers. Right. And he was challenged by that by his own party for a period of time. They've now backed down, and that's why we're seeing this bad legislation. But he creates crises. He preys on fear. Even his comments about Europe and immigrants in Europe that you had played earlier on the show are all about creating a crisis of fear that literally has people afraid that immigrants are causing these problems. I would like for every American to hear these mothers that I spoke to at the federal prison, who are so courageous, have made so many sacrifices in order to come to the United States seeking asylum. As much as Trump would like to portray people coming across the border as murderers and rapists and, all of the terrible things that he says, animals, these are women seeking asylum, seeking security, and I think that these families need to be reunited.
So talk about what's happening today. I mean, there's this astounding poll that's out that says something like 95% of Democrats are opposed to what Trump is doing, but something like 58% of Republicans are supporting what he's doing right now. Trump is going to Capitol Hill. What are these two bills that are being put forward, and what are you instead proposing?
There are two bills. One is from Bob Goodlatte, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, which I sit on that committee. And that bill is a very conservative anti-immigrant bill that would cut legal immigration over the next 5 decades by 25 million. So it eliminates pieces of the family immigration system. It really eradicates the refugee and asylee process. It does not provide a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. It is a bad bill. Ryan then crafted, with some folks from different parts of his caucus, another bill that is supposed to be the compromise bill, because it does offer some things towards the Dreamers, which he was pushed to do that by the fact that there were almost 218 signatures on a discharge petition that essentially would allow for 4 bills to come to the floor. One would have been the DREAM Act, one would have been the Hurd-Aguilar bill, one would have been the Goodlatte bill, and one would have been Ryan's bill. He did not want that to happen. It would have forced his hand. And actually, the Hurd-Aguilar bill, which would have provided a permanent solution for Dreamers, that bill would have passed. It would have gotten enough votes to pass. And he didn't want that to happen. So instead, he said he worked a compromise with his caucus. And unfortunately, a couple of the moderates backed down and said, I will bring this other Ryan bill to the floor. That bill has a few things to sort of calm the fears of some of the moderates who are worried about their reelection prospects, but it also does many of the terrible things that we know he would want to do. It has a lot of the pillars that Trump wanted in his proposal.
The so-called compromise bill.
Correct.
From the Republican lawmakers could lift the 20-day limit currently in place for families to be detained and pave the way to unlimited detention of parents and their children.
That's right.
This is the compromise bill?
That is the compromise bill. And so I refuse to call it a compromise bill. I call it an anti-immigrant bill along with the Goodlatte bill. And anybody who thinks that bill is fixing the problem that we have at the border has another thing coming. This is indefinite detention for children.
Do both include a wall?
Both of them include a wall.
So is this what this is all about? Is that Trump made the stakes so high that people would simply cry uncle, and he would say, see, Democrats aren't supporting a bill that will stop the children from being separated from their parents. And it would be a small price to pay, $25 billion for a wall.
Well, the crazy thing is he actually could have had the wall. Chuck Schumer, without our knowledge, I want to say, or some of our knowledge, offered him a wall. He then changed the stakes and he said, no, I don't just want a wall. I want you to end the family immigration system. I want you to do this. I want you to do that. So the goalpost kept moving. It isn't about the wall anymore. He wants immigration to be out there as an issue for his base. But I think he is miscalculating on this one. I really do. Because I think there are very few Americans, and I know what the polls say about 55% of Republicans currently supporting the proposal, but that number is going down very quickly. And the more we hear these cries of children and see these images of children in cages, they don't want to allow us in because they don't want people to really see. But now people are starting to go in and to see what kinds of conditions we're holding people in. I thought Laura Bush's article was excellent, actually, her op-ed, where she talked about the comparisons to history.
Well, I wanted to ask you, in terms of this issue, him wanting immigration to be the issue, some of the stuff he's also said is he's pointing to Germany in some of his tweets, saying, look at Germany opened up its borders, let all these folks in, and now the crime rate is escalating. It turns out that fact-checking by the New York Times showed that the crime rate in Germany has been going down, not up. Right. And yet he continues to create this image that immigration is associated with, greater immigration is associated with greater crime.
Well, that's what's so offensive to me. You know, I am an immigrant myself. I am one of only a dozen members of Congress, or about a dozen of us, that were born outside of the United States. I came to this country when I was 16 years old by myself. And this portrayal from India, I was born in India, this portrayal of immigrants, and by the way, unless you're Native American, your ancestors came from somewhere, either on slave ships to build this country under pressure or to escape persecution, but came from somewhere else. And for Trump to insinuate, not just insinuate, to claim that immigrants are this terrible threat, he is using a time-tested formula, but he is absolutely wrong. It is offensive, and it is leading to some cruelty that I thought would never be possible in the United States of America in this day and age.
We're going to break, then come back to this discussion. We'll be joined by Sheila Jackson-Lee, Congressmember from Houston. We're talking to Congressmember Pramila Jayapal, Democratic Congressmember from Washington State. On June 9th, she visited some of the 200 asylum seekers who are being held in a prison in her home state. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.
Would you harbor a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, a heretic, convict, or spy? Would you harbor a runaway woman or child, a poet, a prophet, a king? Would you harbor
Would You Harbor Me, performed by the Labyrinth Choir here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, all four living former First Ladies have spoken out against family separation at the border. Rosalind Carter issued a statement Monday saying, quote, the practice and policy today of removing children from their parents' care at our border with Mexico is disgraceful and a shame to our country. Hillary Clinton tweeted, quote, what's happening to families at the border right now is a humanitarian crisis. Every parent who has ever held a child in their arms, every human being with a sense of compassion and decency should be outraged. Laura Bush tweeted, quote, I live in a border state. I appreciate the need to enforce and protect our international boundaries, but this zero-tolerance policy is cruel, it is immoral, and it breaks my heart. And Michelle Obama retweeted Laura Bush's remarks, saying, quote, sometimes truth transcends party.
Meanwhile, on Sunday, First Lady Melania Trump's communications director, Stephanie Grisham, issued a statement to CNN on family separation that said, quote, Mrs. Trump hates to see children separated from their families and hopes both sides of the aisle can finally come together to achieve successful immigration reform. She believes we need to be a country that follows all laws, but also a country that governs with heart. Still with us is Pramila Jayapal, Democratic Congressmember from Washington State. Before she came into the Congress in 2016, she was elected. She was the head of One America, a large immigrant organization in Washington State, and now has gone to the prison in Washington State to see some of the hundreds of asylum seekers held at the SeaTac Bureau of Prisons who were brought up from the border. With us in just a moment, she'll be speaking to us from Statuary Hall, will be Sheila Jackson Lee, who is running over to take her position. But that issue of all of these women, very interesting the role the women are taking. Also that Trump is trying to make women the face of his policy. Yeah. Kirstjen Nielsen, the Department of Homeland Security, reportedly, even with Kelly, the chief of staff, not wanting to hold that news conference, she owned it yesterday. Yeah. Of course, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who has been standing with the president on family separation each day as she's in front of the podium.
Yes, I think that, I have read mixed things about Kirstjen Nielsen. I heard that she did not like this policy, but she is clearly standing up for it now after having denied that it existed before, just a few days ago. But I do think that the former first ladies of both parties speaking out is an indication to us that all Americans must be feeling this, deep sense of cruelty and outrage. I took over a Judiciary Committee hearing last week that was about other bills when we should have been having a hearing on this. And I said, we are outraged. And I have to believe that there are good people on the other side, mothers and fathers, who, if they don't say something today, are going to have to go back to their children and explain why they did nothing as we put children into kennels and tore them away from their mothers. It is absolutely outrageous.
And you've alluded to the issue of many of the Republican moderates fearful how this is going to affect their reelection efforts. I'm wondering, in your conversations in the halls of Congress with some of those moderates, what they might say to you privately.
The frustrating thing is many of them, not just on this issue, but even on other issues, removal of, coverage for pre-existing conditions that the Trump administration has just done. People say to me, yeah, this is terrible. This is going to be very bad for us. This is bad for the country. I mean, they will say things like that, but they are terrified of taking on the bully that has the bully pulpit of the White House.
We are just joined by Congressmember Sheila Jackson Lee, Democrat of Texas. She has represented the 18th Congressional District since 1995, which includes most of central Houston, just back from the Texas border with Mexico, where she joined a delegation of lawmakers visiting a processing center in McAllen and the Southwest Key Program's Casa Padre, as it's called, which houses 1,500 children separated, most of them separated from their parents there in Brownsville. What did you see, Congressmember Sheila Jackson Lee? What are you demanding now that you're in Congress right now where you're standing?
Well, good morning to you. And it's clear that there are acts of indecency. This is an indecent policy promulgated by a single person, and that is the President of the United States. So I saw people huddled in groups, in cages. I saw children who certainly needed to be with their parents. Little baby Roger that I held in my hands was 9 months old. A little Leah, who was 1 year old, both taken from a grandmother and a sister, those who loved them and brought them and would have protected them. Clearly, these persons who are working at the border are working at the behest of the President of the United States. And I think it is very important. This is a nonpartisan issue. I don't even want to call it bipartisan. But it is clear that if we go back as far as 2010, when the Gang of Eight, Democrats and Republicans proposed a comprehensive immigration reform, it was the Republicans who stopped it. It is a Republican president today that refuses to understand that he is violating all acts of decency. And as Bishop Curry has said, it is not biblical. As Laura Bush has said, it breaks her heart. So what I saw was a crisis continuing, not in the making, a crisis continuing, because 2,000 children have now been scattered across America, and the president alone has had a zero tolerance, criminalizing any form of entry and not allowing access to asylum, which, by the way, for those of us who are advocating for decency, we're not reckless as it relates to immigration policy. We believe that this nation is a nation of laws and a nation of immigrants. What we're saying is that these individuals who present themselves, who openly present themselves to a representative of the United States of America, be allowed to pursue a legal option, which is asylum. And that means before the president, before Attorney General Sessions, it could be domestic violence, of which I heard a lot of, and it could be gang violence. And it would break your heart, as Laura Bush said, to hear the stories of these persons who flee into the United States.
And Congresswoman, your response to not only President Trump but his aides raising the issues that some of these people coming across the border are actually involved in smuggling, that they're not actually the parents of these children or relatives, and of the opening to the United States of a greater crime as a result of folks coming across the border. Your response?
Complete folly. And the reason is that I have been on a Homeland Security Committee since the heinous and terrorist act of 9/11. I preceded the creation of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security because my committee created it. I went to ground zero during the recovery period, and I always make that very clear, not rescue, but recovery period. I was there at the beginning. We have professionals. I have interacted with Border Patrol agents for now more than 2 decades. They understand the concept and the actuality of smugglers and coyotes. They come with 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s and 5s and 6s. They come with a bunch. They do not come with a 9-month-old and 1 19-year-old sister. They do not come with a 1-year-old and 1 grandmother. That is not a smuggler. And to make folly of the work of cartels and smuggling large groups of people is absolutely ludicrous, and our Border Patrol agents would tell you they are well informed to know the difference. Maybe they should call the president at 202-456-1111 to let him know that. The other thing is that I think is important to take note of is the fact that the facts of why these people are fleeing are things that many of us could never imagine. You are a pregnant young woman. You borrowed money, your family borrowed money from a private bank, but it was supported, funded, owned by the cartel. When you did not pay, the cartel says to you, soon as you have your baby, I'm going to kill you. You flee 8.5 months pregnant. You did not want to flee 8.5 months pregnant, but your baby would be left without a mother. And you gave birth on your way, and you're sitting in a station where you have had no medical care. The baby is 45 days old and seen no medical professional. Let me just say, and I want to take note of this, I asked one of the Border Patrol persons to have this person provided with medical care. I want to say publicly that that person indicated they would take them to a hospital for both the baby and the mother. But that was one incident where one member of Congress was there along with others. So there are constant indecent acts. Babies and children are not able to be hugged. In the centers that they go to, I asked the question, what do you do with traumatized children? Well, I'm 1 6-year-old. What do you do with bedwetters? Mothers ask these questions because we know when children are traumatized, they begin to have these circumstances. And the answer was attempting to be responsive, but it was, we'll give them what they need, the clothing that they need. That's not what they need. If you're a bedwetter, you are traumatized, and you need the love of that parent, or you need
Congressmember Jackson Lee, you're back from the border. You're in Washington, D.C. now. Trump is going there today to the Capitol. What are you demanding? Trump is saying it's your fault. He's saying it's Pramila Jayapal's fault right here. It's the Democrats' fault that this is happening. What are you going to do?
Well, unfortunately, the president had no experience with government and no involvement with government prior to a shocking election in 2016, and no interest in government per se, except throwing various comments to undermine President Barack Obama. But what I would say is he was not here in 2010 when the Gang of Eight presented their bipartisan, at that time, immigration reform bill, and it was imploded here by the House, by the Republican-controlled House. In addition, I will be looking to Republicans of goodwill. I like to call this nonpartisan, not even bipartisan, to push back on the president when he comes to speak and cajole, and to say clearly to him that you're holding 9-month-old Roger that is now separated from his family.
Will you support a bill that that also includes $25 billion for the wall?
Well, let me just say this. I've always been against the wall. What I do believe we should do is a straight-up bill by Congressman Nadler that we hope to have introduced, that I am co-sponsoring, that deals with not separating children from parents. By the way, we don't need a law. The president could do it right now. I would prefer a bill that had been worked on by Democrats and Republicans, as had been worked on by fellow Texans, of which I was a co-sponsor, that dealt with the DACA, or a comprehensive immigration bill, again, that had been worked on by Democrats and Republicans. The bill that had the DACA language in it, protections, that was bipartisan, had in fact resources for security at the border that was supported in the past by Republicans and Democrats by a Homeland Security bill. So there are many options. What this discussion will be singularly what the president wants: the ending of legal immigration, the ending of diversity visas, and people want to see that as the kind of horror that the president is represented to be.
We have to leave it there. 10 seconds, Congressmember Jayapal.
Amy, I just want to say this. The president needs to stay in the White House, pick up the phone, and reverse this policy. He does not need to be on the Hill. It is on him that this is happening to children. He would love nothing more than for the discussion to turn to legislation and then be able to blame Democrats.
Are you for the abolishing of ICE?
I have been for, as you might know, I did a report back in 2008 on the abuses within the ICE detention system. I have a bill to reform the detention facility overall, and yes, I would love to see ICE go.
That does it for this segment. Of course, we cover this every day. Congressmember Pramila Jayapal speaking to us here in New York from Washington State, and Sheila Jackson Lee, Congressmember from Houston, speaking to us from Statuary Hall in Congress. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to Nicaragua. Stay with us.
Sees his village from a nearby hill. Mojiki thinks of days before the American came. He sees the foreigners in growing numbers. He sees the foreigners in fancy houses. He dreams of days that he can still remember now. Mojiki holds a baggage in his quivering hands. Mujiki sends the package to the American men. Softly, he glides along the streets and alleys. Up comes the wind that makes them run for cover. He feels the time is surely now or never more. The wind.
Joe performing Listening Wind, written by Talking Heads. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, the political crisis in Nicaragua is intensifying. More than 178 people have been killed since widespread demonstrations to oust Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega began in mid-April, when his government announced plans to overhaul and slash Social Security. Amnesty International has accused the Nicaraguan government of using, quote, pro-government armed groups to carry out attacks, incite violence, increase their capacity for repression, and operate outside the law. On Monday, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein, condemned the recent outbreak of violence in Nicaragua.
In Nicaragua, anti-government protests over the past 2 months have led to the killing of at least 178 people, almost entirely at the hand of the police forces and by armed pro-government groups.
But the Nicaraguan government has blamed part of the violence on armed members of the opposition who are trying to overthrow the democratically elected President Ortega. Much of the Nicaragua is at a standstill as opposition groups have set up barricades along key roads, many guarded by masked men armed with homemade mortars. On Monday, opposition groups in Nicaragua's third largest city, Masaya, declared independence from Ortega's government. According to the Washington Post, the opposition formed a 5-member junta of National Salvation to run the city, which was once seen as a Sandinista stronghold.
Efforts to hold a national dialogue between the government and civil society appears to be falling apart. On Monday, key parts of the opposition, including leaders of the student protests, pulled out of the talks, at least temporarily. Meanwhile, some of the student groups have sought assistance from the Trump administration, marking the biggest crisis since Daniel Ortega was elected 11 years ago. Ortega served as president of Nicaragua since 2007. In the late 70s, as leader of the Sandinista National Liberation Front, he helped overthrow the U.S.-backed Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza. We're joined here in New York by Paul Oquist. He is a senior minister for national policy in the Nicaraguan government. Can you talk? We had a previous show where we had a number of people, former Sandinistas, deeply concerned about what's happening, the killing of over 100 protesters in Nicaragua. Your thoughts?
Nicaragua is a polarized society, and there's been violence in the last 2 months on both sides. And what we've seen lately is a wave of violence never seen before in Nicaragua, of kidnappings, of state institutions destroyed, mayor's offices burned down, torture, intimidation, persecution. And there's been a tremendous slant in the news because this is a media war also, and it's a social media war. It's straight out of Gene Sharp's handbook of how to destabilize governments that's been used several times. And I'm not the only one saying this. Gene Sharp's handbook has been recommended by leaders of this movement. You can find that on the internet. And false news, black propaganda is part of the game. And there's no balance in this. It's all one-sided. So the media here and in Europe and elsewhere pick up verbatim the statements that come from the movement. And contrary information somehow is filtered out. For example, on the 16th of June, Francisco Arauz Pineda, who is working to remove barricades, these barricades are not civic, peaceful events. They're coerced. They're violently enforced. And he and another gentleman were killed. And Francisco Arauz Pineda's body, after he was shot and on the street, and you can find a video of this on the internet also, was burnt. They threw gasoline on him and burned his body. And then they put a Sandinista flag on it, and they were joking about it and really not respecting his corpse at all. They were having a little party around his corpse. So these things are not reported. There's no balance. What the government is looking for now is to get out of this cycle of violence, to get back to peace. Nicaragua lived in peace for 11 years. They were the government of national reconciliation and national unity was formed by overcoming the conflicts of the 80s, which was the inclusion of the resistance in the government and of Yatama that had also been part of the armed movement supported by the CIA in the 1980s. Now we need to get out of this cycle of violence, and by the same way, through negotiations, through dialogue. That's what happened in the 80s at Sapua. The government met with the Contra, and the peace agreement started to be hammered out. And the Esquipulas process led to the elections of 1990. Nicaragua is a polarized society. You will not get peace by having one side trying to impose on the other side. If the violent overthrow of the government position, the que se vaya ya position, has a tremendous flaw. It hasn't been thought through. The violence will continue. The violence will continue because one side cannot impose upon the other side. We need a negotiated settlement, and the government is trying to promote that.
Well, I wanted to ask you, when you say the society is polarized, who is the opposition from your perspective? I mean, because obviously there are ex-Sandinistas who have been critical of President Ortega for basically removing anyone who might be critical of him, and who have joined the opposition. So who is leading the opposition?
That group, which is very exaggerated in the media, is a very small minority. In the opinion polls, they poll 1%, the MRS, 1%. And as a matter of fact, that's an obstacle. You had people on this very show saying that they want the violent overthrow of the government, and they want it now. There's a plan already in place to get elections next year. The OAS and Nicaragua have signed a plan which will lead, and there's a calendar for it that's being executed as we speak, to a reform of the National Electoral Council and the electoral law and the electoral rolls by January of next year. But that can't happen unless there's peace. As a matter of fact, we're seeing that the dialogue is very difficult with this violence, with the barricades that are impeding the free movement of people and goods, which are making the life very difficult. Farmers can't get their crops to the market, they're losing money. The people who can't get to work, the people who work and earn a salary every day are in very bad straits. The tourism industry has been brought to a halt, and all the tourist workers, a great many of them,
I want to play a clip of the human rights activist Monica Lopez Boltodano in Managua speaking about the demonstrations in Nicaragua and what the protesters are demanding.
What we have been seeing for the past 45 days is the rise up of a very strong popular rebellion against the violence of Daniel Ortega's government. The rebellion has been led by youth, mostly kids in the youth in the universities, but also it's now become a rebellion of all Nicaraguan population. We have seen massive protests on the streets, and also important actions of protest that are happening. For instance, more than 70% of the roads in Nicaragua are blocked by population that is requesting two basic things: justice for the more than 127 people that have been murdered by Ortega's regime so far, and more than 1,000 people injured, and also the decision of Nicaraguan population that Ortega and his wife leaves power.
So that's Monica Lopez Boltodano, one of the leading protesters.
Did Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo leave power? Because Monica Boltodano says it, because there's barricades on the streets. There's a thing called democratic process.
Let me just
what we're looking for is a democratic process. We're looking for peaceful conditions that can lead to democratic outcomes. It's not, advocate a coup, a violent coup, in a polarized society does not end the violence. The violence would continue. We need institutions. We need democracy now.
Why did the Ortega government open fire on the protesters? More than 100 have been killed.
They're not all. That is a very gross exaggeration.
What would you say?
But they say this.
What do you say?
I say that the government has agreed that the forensic people of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights accompany the Nicaraguan prosecutors in elucidating each and every one of those cases without gross generalizations, which one hears every day, trying to put the 10 policemen who've been killed on the account of the government, that the government burned down its own mayor's offices in various cities, that the X on the houses of the Sandinistas.
We have 20 seconds,
terror.
but we will do a post show. But for right now,
there is.
What are you calling for?
Absolute bias in the media internationally, picking up on this media war by taking the black propaganda and presenting it as fact. There's no balance. What we need is balance. What we need is to dialogue, to get to a peace process which can lead to elections, and the Nicaraguan people decide, not Monica Baltodano and 71 barricades.
We'll leave it there, but continue this discussion and put it online at democracynow.org. Paul Oquist, Senior Minister for National Policy in President Daniel Ortega's government. That is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Special thanks to Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener. Thanks for joining us.